Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Robert Mitchell, but everyone calls me Bobby. In 2018, I was 24 years old and 3 months into my dream job as a forest ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington State. 3 months of proving I belonged here. 3 months of second-guessing every decision. 3 months of wondering if the older rangers saw me as just another college kid playing dress-up in the uniform. That October morning changed everything. The coffee in my thermos still steamed as I unlocked the ranger station door at 6:30 hours. The familiar weight of my duty belt, radio, first aid kit, multi-tool, emergency whistle, felt reassuring against my hips. My boots, still too clean despite weeks of trails, squeaked against the linoleum as I flipped on the lights. District Supervisor Janet Chen was already at her desk, which meant trouble. Janet never arrived before 7 unless something was wrong. "Mitchell," she called without looking up from a manila folder thick with documents. "We need to talk." I poured my coffee, hands steadier than I felt. The station smelled like stale cigarettes from the previous shift and something else, something metallic that made my tongue feel thick. "The Turner case," Janet said, sliding the folder across her desk. "Rachel Turner, 22-year-old hiking alone. Disappeared September 15, 1966, 52 years ago." My fingers felt clumsy as I opened the folder. Black and white photographs showed a young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and bright eyes, the kind of smile that made you want to protect it. "Why are we looking at a 50-year-old cold case?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already twisting into knots. Janet pulled out an evidence bag containing a torn piece of fabric. The material looked fresh, too fresh. "Hiker found this yesterday on the Enchanted Valley Trail. Lab confirmed it. Same fabric, same dye lot as Rachel Turner's missing hiking shirt." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "That's impossible." That's what I said. Then I got the call from her sister. Janet's voice dropped. "Margaret Turner, 78 years old, called 3 times yesterday. Says she's been having dreams about Rachel. Says Rachel is calling for help." My peripheral vision seemed to shrink, like looking through a cardboard tube. This was the kind of case that could make or break a rookie's career, the kind that had veteran rangers shaking their heads and muttering about transfers. "I want you to hike the Enchanted Valley Trail," Janet continued. "Document everything, take photographs, interview any hikers you encounter. Standard missing person protocol." Standard protocol for a 50-year-old case. Sure. I radioed base at 0800 hours before hitting the trailhead. Ranger 247 beginning patrol of Enchanted Valley Trail, investigating recovered evidence in the Turner case. The static that crackled back sounded wrong, too sharp like fingernails on glass. The October air bit through my uniform shirt as I shouldered my pack. 35 pounds of emergency gear, water, and documentation supplies. My GPS showed coordinates 47.7826 degree N, 123.6044 degree W as I stepped onto the trail. For the first 2 miles, everything felt normal. Douglas fir towered overhead, their bark rough under my gloved fingers when I stopped to check trail markers. The sound of my boots on wet earth mixed with the distant call of a Steller's jay, harsh, repetitive cries that seemed to follow my movement. Then I smelled it. Decomposition. Sweet and cloying, like meat left too long in summer heat. But October's cold should have suppressed any smell of decay. I pulled out my radio. "Base, this is 247. Possible wildlife fatality at mile marker 2.3. Investigating." The static came back filled with a voice that wasn't from base, a voice that sounded like a young woman crying. My shoulders climbed toward my ears as I clipped the radio back to my belt. The smell grew stronger as I pushed through a stand of western hemlock, their needles brushing my face like cold fingers. I found the source 50 yards off trail, a deer carcass, but wrong. The body was arranged in a perfect circle of stones, each one placed with deliberate precision. The animal's eyes were gone, leaving dark holes that seemed to track my movement. Around the carcass, carved into the dirt, were symbols I didn't recognize, angular marks that hurt to look at directly. My hands wouldn't obey commands as I fumbled for my camera. 3 photographs documenting the scene from different angles. Each flash seemed to make the shadows deeper. That's when I heard the singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, drifting through the trees from deeper in the forest. The melody was old, older than anything I'd ever heard, with words in a language that made my teeth ache. I should have radioed base, should have marked the GPS coordinates and hiked back to file a report. Instead, I followed the singing. The trail began to change. What started as a maintained path became something else. Older stones, worn smooth by feet that had walked here long before the Park Service existed. The singing grew louder, more insistent, pulling me forward like a rope around my chest. After an hour of walking, I realized I was no longer on any trail marked on my map. The trees pressed closer now, their branches interlocked overhead like fingers blocking out the sun. My GPS showed coordinates that couldn't be right, numbers that placed me miles outside the park boundaries. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard my own breathing, shallow and fast, like I'd been running. Sweat ran cold down my neck despite the October chill. The air tasted of copper and something else, something that made my saliva thick and strange. That's when I saw her. Rachel Turner stood 30 yards ahead on the impossible trail. She looked exactly like her 1966 photograph. Same blonde hair, same bright smile, same clothes. Except her hiking shirt was torn, the missing piece now sealed in an evidence bag back at the station. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "I've been waiting so long." Every instinct screamed at me to run. Every piece of training told me this was impossible. But something else, something I'd never felt before, kept me frozen in place. It was like I could see through her somehow, see something dark and twisted wearing her face like a mask. "You're not Rachel Turner," I heard myself say. Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Of course I am. I'm everyone who ever walked these trails and never walked out." The forest around us began to change. The trees stretched taller, their bark turning black and weeping something that looked like blood. The air grew thick as syrup, making each breath a struggle. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep following or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. "But you're special, Bobby," Not Rachel continued, taking a step closer. "I can feel it in you. The sight, the knowing. You see what others can't." As she spoke, the world shifted again. For just a moment I saw the truth. Not Rachel Turner, but something ancient and hungry. Something with too many limbs and eyes that burned like coals. Then the illusion snapped back and she was just a young woman on a forest trail. "What do you want?" My voice came out as a whisper. "I want to go home," she said. "I want someone to finally understand what happened in 1966. The trail behind me had vanished. I stood in a small clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, dark stains covering its surface. "They thought they could contain me," Not Rachel said, gesturing to the altar. "College students playing with forces they couldn't comprehend. They carved their symbols, spoke their words, and trapped me here. But traps work both ways, Bobby. They couldn't leave either." My radio crackled to life with voices I didn't recognize. Young voices, desperate and afraid. "Help us. It won't let us go. The ritual went wrong." 1966. It's always 1966 here. Understanding hit me like ice water. Not just Rachel Turner, an entire group. Students who'd come to the forest to dabble in the occult and awakened something that had been sleeping for centuries. "You killed them all," I said. "I fed," the thing wearing Rachel's face corrected, "as I have fed on every hiker, every camper, every ranger who wandered too far from the marked trails, as I will feed on you." The trees around us began to bleed. Thick, dark liquid seeped from every trunk, pooling at my feet. The smell of decay intensified until I could taste it with every breath. But something else was happening. That strange sight I'd felt earlier, the ability to see through illusions, was growing stronger. The world flickered between the beautiful forest clearing and something else. A charnel house of bones and rotting flesh. A feeding ground that had existed in this space for half a century. "You see?" Not Rachel purred, her form beginning to shift and blur. "You see what others cannot. That makes you valuable. That makes you mine." The entity shed Rachel's appearance like a snake shedding skin. What emerged was nightmare-made flesh, a writhing mass of shadow and sinew, faces of the dead rotating through its surface like a kaleidoscope of horror. Each face was someone who had walked into these woods and never returned. My hands moved without conscious thought, grabbing something from my belt. Not the radio, not the first aid kit, my emergency whistle. 3 sharp blasts echoed through the clearing, the sound somehow pushing back the writhing darkness. The entity recoiled, its form becoming less solid. "Interesting," it hissed through a dozen mouths. "You have more than just the sight. You have the will." The whistle grew hot in my hand, and I realized it wasn't just any whistle. It was my grandfather's. A World War II military whistle he'd carried through the Pacific Theater. He'd given it to me when I graduated from the Ranger Academy, claiming it would keep the darkness at bay. I'd thought he was just being sentimental. Power flowed through me, something I'd never felt before but somehow knew how to use. The clearing wavered, reality reasserting itself as my will pushed against the entity's influence. "No!" The thing snarled, its form becoming more solid, more threatening. "You don't understand. This is my domain. These are my woods. You cannot—" I blew the whistle again, 3 long blasts, and put every ounce of will I possessed behind the sound. The entity screamed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying animals. The forest around us cracked like a broken mirror. Through the fractures, I glimpsed the real world, the actual enchanted valley trail, daylight streaming through normal trees, the sound of a search helicopter in the distance. But victory came with a price. The entity's scream tore through my mind like claws, shredding something fundamental inside me. I felt myself changing, felt the sight that had protected me becoming something permanent, something that would never let me see the world the same way again. When reality snapped back into place, I was alone on the trail, 3 miles from where I'd started. My radio crackled with normal voices, Janet's voice asking for my location. The GPS showed correct coordinates. The sun filtered through ordinary trees, but I could still see the other world layering over this one like a double-exposed photograph. The shadows held faces. The wind carried voices of the dead. The forest would never again be just a forest. In my hand, my grandfather's whistle had turned black as coal. I found Rachel Turner's body 2 hours later, buried under a cairn of stones that had been there for 52 years. The fabric evidence matched perfectly, a torn piece of her shirt that had somehow been preserved by the entity as a trophy. The official report listed it as a standard recovery of human remains from a 50-year-old case. Accidental death. Case closed. But I know the truth. The entity wasn't destroyed. It was freed. Freed from its prison in that pocket dimension, released back into our world by my own power. I saved myself, but I doomed everyone else who would ever walk these trails after dark. I still work at Olympic National Park, still wear the uniform, still carry the radio and the GPS and all the standard equipment. But now I also carry my grandfather's blackened whistle, and I listen for voices in the static that shouldn't be there. Because I learned something that October day, something they don't teach you in Ranger Academy. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. And some prices are only paid after the victory. The entity still hunts in these woods, and now, thanks to my awakening, I'm the only one who can see it coming. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. My name is Derek Thompson, and after 15 years as a forest ranger at Olympic National Park, I thought I'd seen everything these ancient woods could throw at me. Bears, hypothermic hikers, drug operations, even the occasional mentally unstable camper. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what I encountered during the search for Emma Wilson in October 2018. I've always been a man of science. My forestry degree from Washington State, combined with my methodical approach to wilderness management, had earned me respect among my colleagues and a spotless record with the National Park Service. That record was exactly what was on the line when my radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m. on what should have been a routine Tuesday morning. "Derek, we've got a code yellow. Missing person report just came in." Dispatcher Kelly's voice carried that particular strain I'd learned to recognize over the years, the kind that meant someone's world was falling apart. I set down my morning coffee, the ceramic mug still radiating warmth against my palm. Through the ranger station window, morning mist clung to the towering Douglas firs like cotton gauze, and I could smell the rich earthiness of moss and decomposing leaves that always reminded me why I loved this job. "Copy that, Kelly. What are the details?" 23-year-old female Emma Wilson. Last seen yesterday evening around 1800 hours near the Salt Falls trailhead. Father called it in about 10 minutes ago. Says she was supposed to meet friends for dinner last night and never showed. I grabbed my field notebook, already running through search protocols in my head. The Salt area was tricky. Multiple trail intersections. Old-growth forest thick enough to lose visibility at 30 yards. And if someone wandered off the main paths, well, let's just say we'd found remains years later that way. Any medical conditions? Experience level? Father says she's an experienced hiker. No known medical issues. Here's the thing though, Derek. She was carrying a GPS unit and had a scheduled check-in call with her roommate at 2000 hours that never happened. That detail sent a small chill across my shoulders, though I pushed the sensation aside. Experienced hikers with GPS units didn't just vanish. There were logical explanations. Dead battery, fall injury, maybe she'd simply lost track of time and found shelter somewhere for the night. Weather conditions yesterday evening? Clear skies, temperature dropped to about 45 degrees. No precipitation. I pulled my duty belt from its hook, feeling the familiar weight of radio, first aid kit, and emergency beacons settle around my waist. My supervisor, Jim Hendricks, had made it crystal clear during our last performance review. One more search operation that went sideways, any negative publicity for the department, and I'd be looking for a new career at 42 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me that my job security now depended on finding someone who might already be beyond finding. I'm en route to Solduke, ETA 20 minutes. The drive through the park's winding roads gave me time to think. Emma Wilson. The name felt familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. Maybe she'd been through on previous visits, or perhaps I'd processed her wilderness permit at some point. After 15 years, faces and names tended to blur together. I parked at the Salt Falls trailhead at 7:31 a.m., the gravel crunching under my boots as I stepped out into air that carried the sharp scent of fir needles and that particular dampness that meant the forest was fully awake. My breath formed small puffs in the morning cold as I conducted my equipment check. Handheld GPS unit, first aid supplies, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, headlamp, spare batteries. Standard search and rescue protocol. Emma's silver Honda Civic sat alone in the parking area, a thin layer of dew covering the windshield. I ran the license plate through dispatch, confirmed match. I pulled on my latex gloves and conducted a visual inspection through the windows. Clean interior, no signs of struggle. Purse still sitting on the passenger seat with wallet visible inside. Either she'd felt completely safe leaving valuables in plain sight, or her disappearance had been sudden and unplanned. "Kelly, I'm at the vehicle. Everything appears normal. Beginning preliminary sweep of the main trail now." "Copy that. I've got backup en route. ETA about 40 minutes." The Salt Falls Trail was a popular 1.6-mile loop that shouldn't have posed any challenge to an experienced hiker. I started down the paved section, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. The forest pressed in on both sides, a cathedral of moss-covered trunks that rose 200 feet toward a canopy so thick it filtered the morning light into an amber twilight. About half a mile in, I found the first anomaly. A single hiking boot print in a patch of soft earth beside the trail. But the tread pattern was wrong. Too deep. as if made by someone carrying significant extra weight, and the spacing suggested someone moving with an unusual gait. I photographed it with my digital camera and took GPS coordinates: 47.945 feet d Gwen, 123.8341 degree W. What struck me as odd was that the print pointed directly off-trail toward a section of old-growth forest where the underbrush was so thick it would require serious effort to penetrate. No rational hiker would choose that route, especially not alone and in fading daylight. I followed the direction the print pointed, pushing through salmonberry bushes that grabbed at my uniform sleeve. The scent of the forest intensified. Rich humus, the green smell of chlorophyll, and underneath it all, something else. Something that made my sinuses tingle in a way I couldn't identify. 30 yards off the main trail, I found Emma's day pack. It hung from a branch roughly 8 feet off the ground, suspended in a way that defied easy explanation. The branch itself was healthy and strong, but there was no indication of how the pack had gotten there. No broken branches below that might indicate someone had climbed up. No scuff marks on the bark. No obvious way for it to have been thrown to that height and caught so perfectly. I photographed the scene from multiple angles before carefully retrieving the pack with my extendable hiking pole. Inside I found her wallet, car keys, a half-empty water bottle, energy bars, and a trail map with the Salduke Falls route highlighted in yellow. Most interesting was her smartphone, fully charged with several missed calls from someone listed as Dad, starting at 8:30 p.m. the previous evening. But it was the last item in the pack that made me pause. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there when the pack was manufactured. Handwritten in faded ink, it simply read, "The show must go on. Third act, scene 2. I stared at the note for a long moment, turning it over in my hands. The paper felt old, far older than anything Emma would have been carrying. The edges were yellowed with age, and the ink had that brownish tinge that came from decades of exposure to air and moisture. "Derek, what's your status?" Kelly's voice through the radio made me jump slightly. "I've located the subject's day pack approximately 30 yards northwest of the main trail. Contents appear intact, but the placement is unusual." "Unusual how?" I found myself hesitating. How do you explain to dispatch that a pack was hanging in a tree in a way that suggested it had been placed there by someone with a 10-foot reach? How do you mention a mysterious note without sounding like you'd been spending too much time alone in the woods? Pack was elevated in vegetation. Appears to have been placed rather than dropped. I'm continuing the search pattern. I decided to keep the note to myself for now. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Emma had met another hiker. Maybe she'd placed it there herself for some reason. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through college and 15 years of professional forest service, insisted there was always a logical explanation. I continued deeper into the old growth, following a faint path that seemed to weave between the massive tree trunks with an almost deliberate purpose. The forest floor here was carpeted with centuries of fallen needles, creating a springy surface that muffled sound to an unsettling degree. I could hear my own breathing, the soft crunch of my footsteps. But the normal forest sounds, birds, small animals, even wind through the canopy, had fallen into an unnatural silence. The GPS unit in my hand showed I was moving steadily northwest, away from any established trail system, and into an area of the park I'd rarely had reason to visit. The coordinates were taking me toward a section of old-growth forest that had been logged selectively in the early 1900s, but had been left largely untouched since the area became protected parkland. It was then that I caught my first glimpse of the structure. Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards ahead, I could make out what appeared to be wooden construction. My first thought was an illegal camping structure, maybe something left behind by squatters or drug operations. But as I got closer, the details began to make less and less sense. It was a stage, not a crude platform or shelter, but an actual theatrical stage, complete with a raised wooden platform, painted backdrop scenery depicting a forest glade, and what appeared to be functional lighting equipment powered by a small, barely audible generator hidden behind the backdrop. The whole structure was maybe 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, built with a level of craftsmanship that spoke of professional construction. The wood showed weathering but not decay, as if it had been maintained despite its remote location. Carved into the wooden proscenium arch above the stage were the words, Eternal Players, EST, 1952. I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to process what I was seeing. My radio remained silent. Either I was too far from repeater towers or something was interfering with the signal. I tried to think of rational explanations. Some kind of historical recreation? A permitted educational installation I hadn't been informed about? But there was no access road, no way to transport this level of construction into the deep woods without massive effort. And then I saw Emma. She stood center stage, perfectly motionless, wearing a white dress that definitely hadn't been in her day pack. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style I'd seen in old photographs, and her posture was formal, almost posed. For a moment, relief flooded through me. I'd found her. She was alive. The search was over. "Emma!" I called out. "Emma Wilson!" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, pushing through the ring of underbrush that surrounded the clearing, and as I got nearer, I began to notice details that made my relief curdle into something approaching dread. Emma's eyes were open, but they stared straight ahead with an intensity that suggested she was looking at something I couldn't see. Her hands were positioned precisely at her sides, fingers curved slightly as if holding invisible objects. Most unsettling was her breathing, so shallow and controlled it was barely perceptible. "Emma, my name is Derek Thompson. I'm with the National Park Service. Your family is worried about you." Still no response. I climbed onto the stage, my boots making hollow sounds on the wooden planking. Up close I could see that Emma's white dress was actually a period costume, complete with authentic-looking buttons and detailed embroidery. Her makeup was applied with theatrical precision, and there was a glassy quality to her eyes that reminded me of the taxidermied animals in the visitor center. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and that's when she spoke. "The third act cannot begin until all players have arrived." Her voice was clear but strangely modulated, as if she were projecting to an audience. She still didn't look at me directly. "You have been assigned the role of Thomas Whitmore, the skeptical investigator. Your costume is in the dressing area." She gestured with one precisely controlled movement toward a canvas partition set up behind the backdrop. Through gaps in the fabric, I could see racks of period clothing and theatrical makeup tables lit by battery-powered vanity mirrors. "Emma, I need you to listen to me. You've been missing for over 12 hours. We need to get you medical attention and contact your family. The performance has already begun," she continued in that same projected voice. "You cannot leave until the final curtain. Please take your position for Act 3, Scene 2. The investigator arrives." I grabbed her gently by the shoulders, trying to make eye contact. Her skin felt cold despite the mild weather, and her muscles were rigid with an unnatural tension. When I turned her to face me, her eyes focused on mine for the first time, and what I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. Terror. Pure, unfiltered terror trapped behind a mask of theatrical composure. "Help me," she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. Then louder in that projected voice, "Thomas Whitmore, you must don your costume or the performance cannot continue." That's when I heard the applause. It came from the forest around us, a sound like dozens of hands clapping in appreciative approval. But when I spun around, scanning the trees, I saw no one. The applause continued for exactly the length of time you'd expect after a compelling scene, then stopped with unnatural precision. My scientific mind was scrambling for explanations. Some kind of psychological break? Elaborate hoax? But the terror in Emma's whispered plea had been absolutely genuine, and the construction around me was far too sophisticated for a simple prank. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed from speakers I couldn't locate, "please welcome our final cast member, Thomas Whitmore, as portrayed by Derek Thompson." The voice was cultured, theatrical, with the precise diction of a trained actor from an earlier era. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the clearing with rich baritone tones that somehow made the forest itself feel like an enclosed theater. "Mr. Thompson, your performance begins now. Please note that deviation from the script will result in..." Unfortunate consequences for Miss Wilson. Emma's eyes locked onto mine again, and this time I could see tears forming. "Please," she mouthed silently. I looked around the clearing, at the impossible stage, at Emma trapped in her role, at the theatrical perfection of it all. Every rational instinct screamed that this was some kind of elaborate setup, but the genuine fear in Emma's eyes and the growing sensation that we were being watched by invisible eyes made it impossible to dismiss. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching for rational explanations or play along to protect Emma? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. The generator hummed quietly behind the backdrop, and somewhere in the forest, something that might have been wind rustled through leaves with a sound uncomfortably similar to whispered conversations. I was beginning to understand that my 15 years of ranger experience, my scientific training, my methodical approach to problem solving, none of it had prepared me for this moment. But Emma needed help, and I was the only one who could provide it. I walked toward the dressing area, every step feeling like a commitment to something I didn't fully understand. Behind the canvas partition, I found costume racks organized by character and time period. There was indeed an outfit labeled Thomas Whitmore, a brown wool suit that looked like it came from the 1940s, complete with period-appropriate shoes and accessories. As I changed clothes, I tried to make sense of what was happening. The construction of this stage, the sophisticated lighting and sound system, the period costumes, it represented a massive investment of time, money, and effort, but for what purpose? And how had Emma become involved? The Thomas Whitmore costume fit perfectly, which should have been impossible. The wool felt real, smelled of camphor and age, and when I looked in the theatrical mirror, I barely recognized myself. The transformation was more than just clothing. Something about wearing the costume changed my posture, my expression, even the way I breathed. "Excellent," the booming voice said as I emerged from the dressing area. Act 3, Scene 2 may now commence. Emma remained frozen in her position center stage, but now I could see other figures emerging from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They moved with the same rigid, controlled movements as Emma, all dressed in period costumes, all wearing expressions of theatrical intensity, masking what I was beginning to recognize as profound terror. There was an older woman in a Victorian-era dress, a young man in military uniform, a middle-aged gentleman in formal evening wear. None of them looked at me directly, but I could feel their awareness, their desperate hope that somehow I might be their salvation. "Thomas Whitmore," Emma said in her projected voice, "you have arrived just as the murder has been discovered. Lady Margaret lies dead in the conservatory, and you must determine which member of the household is responsible." As she spoke, one of the other figures, the woman in Victorian dress, collapsed onto a conveniently placed fainting couch, striking a dramatic pose with one hand flung across her forehead. She remained perfectly still, but her eyes tracked my movement with an intensity that made clear she was very much alive and very much terrified. I realized I was expected to respond, to play the role of the investigator. But what lines was I supposed to deliver? What script was I meant to follow? I began, and immediately the invisible audience erupted in disapproval, boos and hisses that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Thomas Whitmore would never hesitate," the voice boomed. "He is a man of decisive action and keen observation. Please, Mr. Thompson, inhabit your character more fully." Emma's eyes found mine again, and this time she risked the slightest nod toward a small table beside the stage. On it sat what appeared to be a script, bound in leather, entitled "The Last Performance, a Mystery in 4 Acts." I walked to the script and opened it, finding Act 3, Scene 2. The dialogue was written in that same faded ink as the note I'd found in Emma's pack, and as I read my lines, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. According to the script, Thomas Whitmore was meant to question each suspect, uncover their secrets, and ultimately identify Lady Margaret's killer. But the final stage direction made my blood run cold. Thomas Whitmore, having solved the mystery, becomes the next victim, ensuring the performance continues eternally. I looked up from the script to find all the other performers watching me expectantly. Emma's eyes held a mixture of hope and despair that made my chest tight with something I couldn't identify. The forest around us had fallen into complete silence. No bird calls, no rustling leaves. Even the generator's hum seemed muffled. It felt like the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for my performance to begin. I thought about my job, about Jim Hendrix's warnings, about my career hanging in the balance. I thought about Emma's family, waiting for news of their daughter. Most of all, I thought about the terror trapped behind theatrical masks, about people who had somehow become prisoners in an impossible performance. That's when I made my decision. Instead of reading the scripted lines, I looked directly out into the forest where I could feel the invisible audience waiting. "This performance ends now," I said in my normal voice, projecting as clearly as I could. "These people are not your actors. They're human beings who deserve to go home to their families." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then the forest exploded with sound. Not applause, but a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the stage. The lights flickered, the backdrop wavered as if caught in a strong wind, and something that might have been laughter echoed from the darkness between the trees. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said, and now there was no theatrical warmth in it, only cold fury. "You seem to misunderstand the nature of your situation. Allow me to clarify." Emma screamed. It wasn't a theatrical scream. It was raw, genuine agony that cut through me like a blade. Her body convulsed while she remained locked in her formal pose, her face contorting in pain, while her hands stayed precisely positioned at her sides. The other performers began to twitch and jerk, their careful theatrical composure cracking to reveal the suffering underneath. "Stop!" I shouted. "Stop it! I'll play the role, just stop hurting them." The screaming stopped immediately. Emma's face returned to its composed mask, but tears streamed down her cheeks in silver tracks that caught the stage lights. "Much better," the voice purred. "Now then, shall we continue with Act 3, Scene 2? I looked down at the script, at the lines that would ultimately lead to my own character's death and absorption into this nightmare performance. Then I looked at Emma, at the other trapped performers, at the impossible situation my rational mind still couldn't fully accept. But sometimes I realized, you don't need to understand something to act. Sometimes you just need to choose between fear and courage, between self-preservation and doing what's right. I closed the script and tossed it into the shadows beyond the stage. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, speaking both to the invisible presence and to the trapped performers. "I'm going to get these people out of here, all of them, and you're going to let us go." The laughter that followed seemed to come from the trees themselves, a sound like wind through hollow branches. "And how exactly do you propose to accomplish this, Mr. Thompson? You cannot leave the performance area. None of you can. The show, as they say, must go on." I tested this claim by walking to the edge of the stage and stepping down onto the forest floor. Immediately, it felt like I was pushing against an invisible wall, a resistance that grew stronger with each step away from the performance area. By the time I was 10 feet from the stage, the pressure was so intense I could barely breathe. When I turned back toward the stage, the resistance vanished and I could move normally again. "You see?" the voice continued with obvious satisfaction. "The performance space is carefully bounded. You may move freely within the theater, but the audience requires that all players remain available for their roles." I looked at the other performers, still frozen in their positions, and a thought began to form. What happens when a performance ends naturally, when the script is completed? This particular script has no ending, Mr. Thompson. It is designed to continue indefinitely, with new cast members replacing those who wear out. The implication made my stomach lurch. How long had these people been trapped here? The woman in Victorian dress could have been here for decades if the established 1952 sign was accurate. The young man in military uniform might have vanished during Vietnam. Emma was just the latest addition to a collection that had been growing for over half a century. But there had to be a way out. There was always a way out. I just had to think like a scientist, not like a terrified ranger who'd stumbled into something beyond his understanding. If this is a performance, I called out to the invisible audience, then you need an audience. Who's watching this show? The silence stretched long enough that I thought I wouldn't get an answer. Then the voice returned, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in it. The audience is eternal. They have been with us since the beginning. But where are they? I don't see anyone. How do I know they're even real? You doubt the audience? The voice carried a note of genuine surprise. I doubt everything about this situation. I'm a man of science, remember? I believe in evidence. So far, all I've seen is some kind of advanced sound system and a bunch of terrified people being forced to act out roles they never auditioned for. The forest around us began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The air itself seemed to thicken and coalesce, and gradually, shapes began to form in the darkness between the trees. They were people, or had been people once, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sitting in invisible chairs arranged in perfect theater seating around the clearing. But they were translucent, flickering like bad television reception, and their faces held expressions of desperate hunger that made me take an involuntary step backward. The audience, the voice said with renewed confidence. They have been waiting so very long for quality entertainment. I studied the ghostly crowd, noting details with my trained observer's eye. Their clothing spanned decades: 1950s formal wear, 1960s casual dress, 1970s fashion, up through what looked like early 2000s styles. All of them focused on the stage with an intensity that suggested they were somehow feeding on the performance. How long have they been dead? I asked. Death is such a limiting concept, Mr. Thompson. They are simply between states. The performance sustains them, gives them purpose. An idea began to form, desperate and probably stupid, but potentially our only chance. What would happen if the performance was so bad that the audience left? Impossible. The audience cannot leave. They are bound here just as you are bound here. But what if they wanted to leave? What if the performance was so terrible, so offensive to their artistic sensibilities that they demanded their money back? The uncertainty returned to the voice. The performance has always been adequate. I looked at Emma, still frozen in her pose, and made a decision that went against every professional instinct I'd developed in 15 years of careful, methodical forest service. I was going to give the worst performance in theatrical history. All right, I announced, picking up the discarded script. Let's continue with Act 3, Scene 2. But I'm going to interpret Thomas Whitmore as a character who's completely incompetent, tone-deaf, and utterly without artistic merit. I began to recite the lines, but in a deliberately flat, monotone voice while adding inappropriate physical comedy. When the script called for dramatic intensity, I spoke like I was reading a grocery list. When it demanded subtle investigation, I made exaggerated, cartoonish gestures. The ghostly audience began to shift uncomfortably in their invisible seats. Some of them started to flicker more rapidly, as if their connection to the performance space was becoming unstable. Mr. Thompson, the voice warned, you are not performing the role correctly. This is my interpretation, I replied, continuing to butcher every line with enthusiastic incompetence. Art is subjective, right? I encouraged the other performers to break character as well, to resist the compulsion to deliver their lines with theatrical precision. Emma was the first to understand, beginning to deliver her responses in an equally flat, mechanical tone that drained all drama from the dialogue. The ghostly audience was becoming agitated. Some were starting to fade entirely, while others flickered between visibility and transparency. A few were actually standing up, looking around as if searching for exits. Stop, the voice commanded, but now it sounded strained, desperate. The performance must maintain artistic standards. The audience requires nothing, I interrupted. They're dead. They've been dead for decades. Whatever's keeping them here, whatever's keeping us here, it's not their choice, it's yours. I turned to address the fading spirits directly. You don't have to stay. You don't have to watch this travesty of a performance. You have permission to leave. Go find whatever peace you were denied when this thing trapped you here. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The ghostly audience began to dissolve, spirits standing and walking away into the darkness between the trees. Some paused to look back at the stage with expressions that might have been gratitude before fading completely. As each spirit departed, the invisible barriers around the performance space grew weaker. I could feel the change in the air, like pressure equalizing after a storm front passes. "No!" the voice wailed, all pretense of theatrical dignity abandoned. "The performance, the eternal performance, it cannot end." Emma suddenly gasped and staggered, her rigid posture finally breaking as whatever force had been controlling her movements lost its power. The other performers collapsed to their knees, free but disoriented after what might have been years or decades of supernatural compulsion. "The show's over," I told the invisible presence. "Time to bring down the final curtain." The stage lights flickered and died. The generator behind the backdrop coughed once and fell silent. In the growing darkness, I could hear the normal sounds of the forest returning. Bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant sound of running water. But we still had to get out of here. Emma was conscious but confused, her memory of recent events fragmented and uncertain. The other performers were in various states of disorientation. The woman in Victorian dress spoke with an accent that suggested she might have been trapped here since the 1950s, while the young man in military uniform kept asking about a war that had ended decades before he was born. I gathered everyone together and used my GPS unit to plot a course back to the Sol Duke trailhead. The device worked normally now, showing our location and the route to safety. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the stage. It was already beginning to show signs of decay. The wood looking weathered and rotten, the paint peeling from the backdrop, the whole structure appearing to age decades in minutes. Whatever supernatural force had maintained it was gone, and time was finally catching up. The walk back to the trailhead took nearly 3 hours. I had to help the other rescued performers, some of whom seemed confused about what decade they were living in. Emma recovered quickly, though she had no memory of anything between leaving her car the previous evening and waking up on the stage in costume. By the time we reached the parking area, backup had arrived, park rangers, EMTs, and local law enforcement. The debriefing was complicated. How do you explain finding missing persons who had disappeared across several decades? How do you write a report about a supernatural theater that was already crumbling back into the forest? In the end, the official record stated that I had located Emma Wilson and 3 other individuals who appeared to be suffering from exposure and possible head trauma in a remote area of the park. The medical examinations found them to be in remarkably good health considering their ordeal, though none of them could provide clear information about their experiences. Emma was reunited with her family, and the other rescued individuals were eventually identified through missing persons databases and reconnected with relatives who had given them up for dead years or decades earlier. The official explanation involved a suspected cult operating in the remote wilderness, though no physical evidence of such a group was ever found. My job was secure. In fact, my successful resolution of multiple missing persons cases earned commendations from both the Park Service and local law enforcement. Jim Hendricks never mentioned performance reviews again, but sometimes, late at night when I'm alone at the ranger station, I think about that voice in the forest, about the desperate hunger of the ghostly audience, about the terror trapped behind theatrical masks. And I wonder if there are other performances out there in other remote corners of the wilderness, other supernatural shows that must go on. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in scientific method and logical analysis, insists that there has to be a rational explanation for what happened. Group hallucination, ergot poisoning from forest fungi, mass hysteria triggered by isolation and stress. But Emma's whispered "help me" was real. The terror in those trapped performers' eyes was genuine. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the old growth forest in just the right way, it sounds uncomfortably like applause. I've learned that being a skeptic doesn't mean refusing to believe in anything beyond your current understanding. It means maintaining enough intellectual humility to acknowledge that the universe might be stranger and more complex than your training prepared you for. I'm still a man of science. I still believe in evidence and logical analysis. But now I also believe that sometimes when people disappear in the wilderness, they're not just lost. Sometimes they're recruited for performances they never auditioned for, in theaters that shouldn't exist, for audiences that should have moved on to whatever comes after applause decades ago. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. The clearing where I found the stage is marked as unstable terrain, access prohibited on current park maps. Officially, it's due to concerns about soil erosion and potential sinkhole activity. But sometimes I hike out there anyway, just to check. The stage is gone now, rotted back into the forest floor like it was never there at all. But if you know where to look, you can still see the outline in the moss and fallen leaves. A perfect rectangle where nothing quite grows the same way as the surrounding vegetation. And if you're very quiet and the wind is just right, you can still hear the faintest echo of applause drifting through the trees. But that might just be your imagination. After all, some performances never really end. My name is Ryan Blackwood, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for exactly 8 months and 12 days when this story begins. Not that I'm counting or anything. Okay, fine, I was counting. Every rookie counts. We count days until we stop feeling like frauds wearing the uniform. We count successful rescues until we've proven we belong. We count the nights we don't wake up in cold sweats, wondering if we'll screw up when it really matters. I never imagined I'd stop counting altogether after what happened with Madison Foster. It started on a Tuesday morning in October 2016. The Pacific Northwest autumn had settled over the Olympic Peninsula like a damp wool blanket, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee while reviewing overnight incident reports when Supervisor Janet Morrison dropped a manila folder on my desk with the particular thud that meant my day was about to get complicated. "Blackwood, you're taking point on this one," she said, her weathered face unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Inside the folder was a photograph of a young woman with strawberry blonde hair and a gap-toothed smile. Madison Foster, aged 19, last seen June 15, 2014. The case had gone cold 2 years ago. "Why now?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than the knot of anxiety in my stomach felt. Janet tapped a second photo with her index finger. "Hiker found this yesterday on the Hoh River Trail, mile marker 7. It was Madison's driver's license, pristine condition, like it had been laminated yesterday, instead of spending 2 years in the Olympic wilderness." The photo showed the same gap-toothed smile, but something about seeing it there on that government-issued card made my shoulders climb toward my ears without permission. "Could have been dropped by a previous search team," I suggested, though even as I said it, something felt wrong. My mouth had gone dry, leaving my coffee tasting like copper pennies. That's what I thought, until I saw where it was found. Janet slid a topographic map across my desk, a red X marking the location. Mile marker 7 puts it smack in the middle of the old ranger trail. I studied the map, my vision narrowing to just that red X as everything else seemed to blur at the edges. "I don't see an old ranger trail on here." "Because it doesn't exist. Not on any official map, anyway." Janet's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Local legend says it was created by Augustus Pine, a ranger who died in 1952. Story goes he got lost during a blizzard, wandered for days trying to find his way back to headquarters. They found his body 3 weeks later, but searchers swore they kept finding his footprints in places they'd already been. Fresh prints in snow that had fallen after he was confirmed dead." The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through forestry school and ranger training, wanted to laugh, but my hands had started trembling just enough that I had to set my coffee mug down before I spilled it. "Janet, come on. You don't actually believe?" "I don't believe anything. I follow evidence. And the evidence says Madison Foster's license showed up in a place that shouldn't exist, looking like it was dropped yesterday instead of 2 years ago." She stood up, smoothing down her uniform jacket. "You wanted a chance to prove yourself? Here it is. Take the quad bike, follow the Hoh River Trail to mile marker 7, and figure out what the hell is going on." An hour later, I was 20 miles deep into Olympic National Park, the quad bike's engine echoing off ancient Douglas firs that had been standing when Columbus was still getting seasick. The familiar weight of my gear felt comforting. Radio clipped to my shoulder, GPS unit on my belt, first aid kit and emergency supplies in my pack. Standard protocol, everything by the book. I should have known that books don't mean much when you're dealing with the impossible. Mile marker 7 appeared exactly where the map said it would, a simple white post driven into the earth beside the main trail. I parked the quad and began examining the area where the license had been found, looking for any other evidence that might have been missed. That's when I saw it. 20 feet off the main trail, barely visible through the undergrowth, was what looked like another path. Not an animal trail, too wide, too deliberately cleared. The kind of trail that gets made by human feet, walking the same route over and over again until the forest gives up and lets them pass. I checked my GPS. According to the satellite data, I was standing in the middle of a dense thicket of salmonberry bushes. No trail, no clearing, just 20 feet of impenetrable vegetation. But I could see it. Hell, I could smell it. That distinctive scent of disturbed earth and crushed vegetation that marked every trail in the park. My hands were going numb despite the mild temperature, fingers refusing to grip my radio properly when I tried to call in the discrepancy. Base, this is Ranger Blackwood at mile marker 7. I'm seeing... I need you to double-check the topographic data for this location. Static. Then Janet's voice scratched with interference. Blackwood, your signal is breaking up. Please repeat. I tried again, but got only white noise in response. My GPS unit was flickering between coordinates like it couldn't decide where I actually was. The rational explanation was equipment malfunction. Happens all the time in the deep woods, especially with the October weather playing hell with electronics. But standing there, looking at a trail that couldn't exist, rational explanations felt about as useful as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. I made the decision that would change everything. I followed the trail. The path was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, winding through old-growth forest that grew thicker and more primordial with each step. Douglas firs gave way to massive western hemlocks, their trunks so wide that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The canopy above was so dense that it felt like walking through a living cathedral, green light filtering down in dusty shafts that danced with insects I couldn't identify. My boots crunched on a carpet of needles and moss that seemed to absorb all sound. Even my breathing echoed strangely, as if the forest was swallowing the noise before it could travel more than a few feet. The smell of decay was stronger here, not the clean decay of autumn leaves, but something older and more organic, like meat left too long in the sun. I'd been walking for what felt like an hour when I realized I hadn't seen a single familiar landmark. No numbered mile markers, no park service signs, no maintenance blazes on the trees. Just the trail, stretching ahead and behind like a ribbon through the endless green. That's when I tried to turn around. The trail behind me was gone. Not overgrown, not blocked. Gone. Where I'd just been walking was a wall of ancient trees so tightly packed that even a mouse would have trouble squeezing through. My breathing went shallow and rapid, like someone was slowly tightening a belt around my chest. The peripheral vision that had been so sharp just moments before collapsed to a tunnel focused straight ahead. I fumbled for my GPS, hands now completely numb and clumsy. The screen showed only static. My radio produced nothing but white noise shot through with sounds that might have been voices. Distant, distorted, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. This isn't happening, I said aloud, just to hear my own voice. But the forest swallowed the words, like it was hungry for them. That's when I smelled smoke. Not the clean smell of a campfire, but the thick, greasy smoke of something burning that shouldn't be. Something that had meat in it. The scent hit the back of my throat and made my stomach lurch, but I followed it anyway because it was the only thing that seemed real in a place where reality had apparently taken a coffee break. The trail curved around a massive cedar and suddenly opened into a clearing that couldn't have been there a second before. In the center was a fire pit built from stones that looked far older than any Park Service installation. The flames were wrong, too blue, too cold-looking, throwing shadows that moved independently of their source. Beside the fire was a figure in a Forest Service uniform. Not just any uniform, one of the old ones from the 1950s. Heavy wool, brass buttons, campaign hat with a wide brim. The man wearing it looked exactly like what central casting would order for grizzled forest ranger. Weathered face, salt and pepper beard, eyes like chips of flint. He looked up as I approached and smiled with too many teeth. "Ryan Blackwood," he said, voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades in the wilderness. "Been waiting for you." My throat had closed up completely. When I finally managed to speak, it came out as barely a whisper. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything that happens on my trail." He gestured around the clearing with one hand. The other, I noticed, was missing 3 fingers. Old injury, healed over with thick scar tissue. "Augustus Pine, Olympic National Forest, 1925 to 1952. And you're trespassing. The thing about fear, real fear, the kind that rewires your brain and turns your skeleton to jelly, is that it doesn't feel like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no slow-motion moments of realization. Just a sudden understanding that you're in the presence of something that shouldn't exist, and all your training and preparation mean exactly jack shit." "You're dead," I said, because sometimes stating the obvious is all your brain can manage. Augustus laughed, and the sound made the flames dance higher. "Death is just another kind of patrol, son. Same territory, different shift schedule." He stood up, and I could see that his uniform was rotting. Moss grew through the fabric, and things that might have been insects scurried in and out of holes worn by decades of decay. "Madison Foster," I managed to get out. "What happened to her?" "She found my trail, just like you did. Just like dozens of others over the years." He began walking around the fire pit, and I realized that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. "This trail doesn't show up on any map because it goes places maps can't follow, and everyone who finds it becomes part of it, whether they want to or not." That's when I saw them. They emerged from the tree line like shadows gaining substance. Hikers, campers, other rangers, all wearing the clothes they'd died in. Some looked fresh, like they'd been killed yesterday. Others were barely held together by will and whatever dark force animated this place. But all of them moved with the same shuffling gait. All of them had the same empty stare, and all of them were walking toward me. Madison Foster was among them. Her strawberry blonde hair was matted with something dark and wet, and her gap-toothed smile had been widened by whatever had torn half her face away. She still wore the hiking clothes from the day she disappeared. North Face jacket, Patagonia shorts, Morel boots. But 2 years of being dead had not been kind to her. "The trail needs caretakers," Augustus said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of my impending death. "Souls to maintain it, to guide new travelers, to make sure it stays hidden from those who would destroy it. You should feel honored. I don't usually recruit rangers so young, but you've got something special about you, don't you, Ryan? Something that lets you see things others can't." He was right, and I'd known it my whole life. The ability to sense things just slightly out of phase with normal reality. To spot movement in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at it. To know when someone was lying not by their words, but by the way the air around them seemed to shimmer. I'd thought everyone could do it until I mentioned it to my parents at age 7 and got rushed to an eye doctor. Now, faced with something that was definitely out of phase with normal reality, that ability was screaming warnings so loud it felt like my skull might crack. "I can feel your potential from here," Augustus continued, and suddenly he was standing right beside me, though I hadn't seen him move. His breath smelled like grave dirt and old blood. All that untapped power, just waiting for the right catalyst. Death is an excellent catalyst, Ryan. It strips away all the unnecessary parts and leaves only what matters. The circle of dead hikers had tightened around us. Madison was close enough now that I could see the maggots writhing in what remained of her eye socket. She reached out with fingers that ended in bone instead of nails and whispered my name in a voice like wind through dry leaves. That's when something inside me snapped, not broke. Snapped like a rubber band that had been stretched to its limit and suddenly contracted. I felt it in my chest first, a warmth that spread outward through my arms and legs and up into my head. The world suddenly became hyper-clear, every detail standing out in sharp relief. I could see the individual threads of decay running through Augustus's uniform, could smell the specific cocktail of decomposition that surrounded each of the walking corpses, could hear the whispered conversations they were having in languages that had been dead for centuries, and I could see the trail for what it really was. It wasn't just a path through the forest. It was a wound in reality itself, a place where the normal rules didn't apply because something had torn them away and never bothered to repair the damage. The fire in the pit wasn't burning wood. It was burning the life force of everyone who'd ever been trapped here, their energy feeding whatever dark force kept Augustus and his collection animated. "Interesting," Augustus said, and for the first time since I'd encountered him, he looked surprised. "Very interesting indeed. I haven't seen raw talent like that in, well, decades." But I wasn't listening to him anymore. That warm feeling in my chest was spreading, growing stronger, and with it came an understanding of what I was seeing. The trail existed because Augustus believed it existed, and everyone who'd been trapped here had added their belief to his, making it more real with each death. But belief was a two-way street. If I could believe in something else strongly enough. I closed my eyes and focused on what I knew to be true. Olympic National Park. Mile marker 7 on the Hoh River Trail. My quad bike parked beside a white post. The real world, the one where dead rangers didn't collect souls and trails didn't move when you weren't looking. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was flickering like a bad television signal. Augustus's face contorted with rage, revealing teeth that were definitely not human. "You cannot leave," he snarled, his voice now carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. "No one leaves my trail. I am the ranger here. I decide who comes and goes." But he was wrong. I was the ranger here. I had the badge, the training, the authority. This was my park, my territory, my responsibility. And that meant these people, all of them, even the ones who'd been dead for years, were under my protection. The warm feeling in my chest exploded outward like a flashbang grenade made of pure will. Augustus screamed and staggered backward, his form becoming translucent. The circle of dead hikers wavered like heat mirages, their solid forms beginning to dissolve. But something was fighting back. The trail itself seemed to rear up like a living thing, reality bending and twisting as Augustus's rage fed back into the wound that sustained him. Trees began to move, their massive trunks grinding against each other with sounds like breaking bones. The ground under my feet started to buckle and heave, opening cracks that showed not earth beneath, but endless darkness. Madison Foster's corpse lunged at me, her remaining eye blazing with Augustus's fury, her ruined mouth opening to reveal a throat full of thorns. I dodged sideways and felt her fingernails, now definitely more bone than keratin, rake across my jacket, tearing through the fabric like it was tissue paper. That's when I understood what Augustus meant about death being a catalyst. The warm power in my chest wasn't just enhanced by fear. It was enhanced by pain, by damage, by the proximity of violence. Every time one of the walking corpses came close enough to hurt me, I could feel my abilities growing stronger. So instead of running, I let them come. A hiker in a shredded REI jacket grabbed my arm, and I felt his touch burn like acid through my sleeve. But in the same instant, I could see the threads of force that held him together, the dark energy that animated his corpse. I reached out with something that wasn't quite thought and wasn't quite will and simply severed them. He collapsed into component parts that had been dead for far too long. A park ranger from the 1970s, I could tell from the uniform, came at me with a camp hatchet, the blade black with old blood. I caught his wrist as he swung, felt my bones grind together from the force of his supernatural strength, and used the pain as fuel to push back with everything I had. He didn't just dissolve, he unraveled, his existence coming apart like a sweater with a pulled thread, until there was nothing left but a pile of moldy cloth and brass buttons. One by one, I faced them down. One by one, I sent them to whatever rest they should have found decades ago. And with each victory, I could feel the trail itself weakening, reality reasserting itself bit by bit. Madison was the last. She stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer approaching but not retreating either. The decay that had claimed half her face was healing as I watched, the maggots falling away, the torn flesh knitting itself back together. Her strawberry blonde hair regained its shine. Her gap-toothed smile became warm instead of horrifying. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was fully human again. "I've been waiting so long to go home." She looked down at her hands, solid and healthy, then back up at me. "Will it hurt?" I thought about lying, about telling her what she wanted to hear, but she deserved the truth. "I don't know, but it can't hurt worse than staying here." She nodded, stepped forward, and took my hand. Her touch was warm, alive, real. "Tell my parents I wasn't scared at the end, okay? Tell them I fought as long as I could, but when it was time to let go, I wasn't afraid." I reached out with that strange new ability, but instead of severing the threads that held her here, I followed them. Traced them back to their source, to the moment 2 years ago when she'd first stumbled onto Augustus's trail and become trapped in his web of belief and bitter death. And I changed that moment. It should have been impossible. But standing there in a clearing that shouldn't exist, having just defeated the walking dead with psychic powers I'd never known I possessed, impossible felt like a pretty meaningless concept. Madison Foster smiled one last time, her form becoming translucent as the timeline shifted around us. "Thank you, Ranger Blackwood, for everything." Then she was gone, and with her went the last thread holding Augustus's trail together. The clearing collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Trees folded in on themselves, the ground cracked and split, and reality came rushing back in like water through a burst dam. I found myself falling through darkness that tasted like copper and rotting leaves. Augustus's final scream echoing around me as his decades-long vigil finally came to an end. I woke up beside mile marker 7 on the Hoh River Trail, my quad bike exactly where I'd left it. My radio was working perfectly, GPS showing my correct coordinates, the afternoon sun filtering through perfectly normal Douglas firs. If not for the tears in my jacket and the exhaustion that felt like I'd been awake for a week straight, I might have convinced myself it had all been a hallucination. But when I checked my equipment, I found something that proved it had been real. Madison Foster's driver's license was in my jacket pocket, not the pristine one that had been found yesterday, but a weathered, faded copy that looked like it had spent 2 years in the Olympic wilderness. As I watched, it crumbled into dust that the wind scattered through the trees. At the same time, my radio crackled to life. "Blackwood, this is base. We just got word from the Clark County Sheriff's Department. Madison Foster walked into a police station in Longview 20 minutes ago. She's alive, Ryan. She's alive, and she's asking for you." I made it to Longview in record time, running code 3 with my emergency lights flashing the entire way. The police station was buzzing with activity. Reporters, social workers, FBI agents trying to figure out how a girl who'd been missing for 2 years could just walk in like nothing had happened. But Madison remembered everything. Every day of captivity, every horror Augustus had shown her, every moment of her existence as one of his walking dead. She also remembered me reaching back through time to give her a different ending to her story. "The doctors say I shouldn't remember any of it," she told me as we sat in the police station break room, sharing coffee that tasted like salvation after everything we'd been through. "They think I'm traumatized, that I've constructed false memories to cope with whatever really happened to me. But I know it was real, and I know what you did to save me." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there had to be a rational explanation for everything that had happened. But looking at her, alive, healthy, laughing with her parents in the next room, I couldn't bring myself to question the impossible. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more supernatural Ranger stories. The official report I filed was a masterpiece of creative writing. Equipment malfunction led to temporary disorientation. No evidence of foul play. Missing person located alive and well through unrelated law enforcement activities. Case closed. But that wasn't really the end. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. My ability to sense the unnatural hadn't faded. If anything, it had gotten stronger. I could feel the presence of lost hikers from miles away, could sense when someone was in genuine danger versus just unprepared. Other rangers started commenting on my lucky streak of successful rescues, how I always seemed to know exactly where to look. I tried to tell myself it was just enhanced observational skills, better pattern recognition, improved intuition. But deep down, I knew the truth. What had happened on Augustus Pine's cursed trail had changed me in ways I was still discovering, and sometimes late at night when the wind was blowing through the Olympic peaks just right, I could swear I heard voices calling from the deep forest. Not Augustus. His trail was gone forever, unraveled when I'd changed Madison's fate. But other voices. Other lost souls who needed someone with my particular talents to help them find their way home. The cost of defeating Augustus and saving Madison wasn't immediately apparent. It took weeks before I understood what I'd given up. My abilities came with a price. Every time I used them, every time I reached out with that strange perception to locate a missing hiker or sense supernatural danger, I could feel a little more of my normal life slipping away. Colors seemed less vivid. Food lost its taste. The simple pleasures that used to bring me joy, a good book, a conversation with friends, even sleep, became muted, distant, like I was experiencing them through heavy glass. I was becoming something other than fully human, more capable maybe, definitely more useful in my job as a ranger, but less connected to the everyday world that normal people inhabited. The worst part was that I couldn't stop. Every time my radio crackled with news of another missing person, every time someone's child or spouse or parent vanished into the Olympic wilderness, I had to help. Because I was the only one who could. The only one who could see through the veils that separated the natural world from the unnatural dangers that lurked just out of phase with normal reality. Madison visited me 3 months later, on a crisp January morning when frost turned the forest into something out of a fairy tale. She looked healthy, happy, completely recovered from her 2-year ordeal. But she could see the change in me immediately. "The power's eating you alive, isn't it?" she asked quietly as we walked along the Hoh River Trail, the real one, not Augustus's impossible version. "It's not eating me," I said, though even I could hear how hollow my voice sounded. "It's just changing me, making me better at my job." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes full of the kind of understanding that only comes from having been touched by forces beyond normal comprehension. "Ryan, you saved my life. You gave me back everything I'd lost, but you don't have to sacrifice everything you are to help other people." "Don't I?" I gestured around us at the forest that had become both my workplace and my prison. "How many other people are out there trapped in situations like yours? How many could I save if I just accept what I've become and stop fighting it? And how many will you fail to save because you've lost touch with what makes you human?" She reached out and took my hand, and for just a moment I could feel warmth again. Real warmth, not the cold fire that powered my abilities. The ranger who saved me wasn't some supernatural force. He was a scared kid who decided that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. Don't lose that person, Ryan. Don't let him become another ghost in these woods. I wanted to promise her that wouldn't happen. But standing there in the forest, that had already claimed so much from both of us, feeling the weight of my responsibilities and the cold touch of inhuman power flowing through my veins, I couldn't bring myself to make a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more paranormal ranger experiences. That was 8 years ago. I'm still a ranger at Olympic National Park, though still human is a question that gets harder to answer with each passing season. I've saved 47 people from supernatural threats that would have killed them. I've closed doorways to places that shouldn't exist, banished entities that had no business in our reality, and prevented 3 separate attempts by various occult groups to establish permanent footholds in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The cost continues to mount. I sleep maybe 2 hours a night now, and I dream in colors that don't exist. I haven't tasted food in 6 months, though my body still functions perfectly. I can go weeks without speaking to another human being and not feel lonely, because I'm never really alone anymore. There are always voices at the edge of perception, calling for help from places that exist just slightly to the left of normal reality. But every time I think about walking away, about finding some way to give up these abilities and try to reclaim what's left of my humanity, I remember Madison's smile when she saw her parents again. I remember the dozens of other families who got to hug their loved ones because I was there when normalcy failed and something else was needed. Maybe that's not a fair trade. Maybe I gave up too much to save too few. But it's the trade I made, and I live with it every day. The Olympic Peninsula is safer because of what I've become. The price was my soul, measured out one rescue at a time, and some nights when the wind is just right and the forest whispers secrets that only I can hear, I think it might have been worth it. Madison Foster has 2 children now, a house in Portland, and a career as a social worker helping other trauma survivors. She sends me a Christmas card every year, always with the same message: "Thank you for bringing me home." Those 4 words make everything else bearable, even if I can never go home myself. My name is Ryan Carter, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 17 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these Washington wilderness could throw at me. Missing hikers, bear encounters, flash floods, hypothermia cases. I'd handled them all with the confidence that comes from nearly 2 decades of experience. My supervisors trusted me. Hell, the newer rangers looked up to me. I was the guy they called when things got complicated. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what happened during the search for Brittany Wilson in October 2018. The call came in at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, yanking me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. My Nokia buzzed against the nightstand with that particular urgency that meant someone's life was hanging in the balance. "Carter here," I answered, already swinging my legs out of bed. "Ryan, thank God." It was dispatch, Jenny's voice, tight with stress. "We've got a missing person report. 23-year-old female, Brittany Wilson, disappeared somewhere in the Hoh River Valley yesterday evening. Family's been calling all night." I was already pulling on my uniform pants, the familiar weight of the duty belt a comfort against my hip. Last known position? That's the problem. Her car was found at the South Fork Hoh River trailhead around 11 p.m., but her hiking permit said she was planning to do the Upper Hoh River Trail. 2 completely different areas, Ryan. And here's the kicker. Her cell phone GPS shows her last location about 3 miles southeast of where her car was parked. None of it makes sense. My stomach clenched, but not from hunger. In 17 years, I'd learned that when the initial evidence doesn't add up, you're usually dealing with either a very confused victim or something much worse. Weather? Clear for now, but we've got a front moving in tonight. Rain, dropping temperatures. If she's injured and exposure sets in, I didn't need her to finish. October in the Olympic Peninsula was unforgiving. Daytime temps in the 50s, nighttime dropping into the 30s. An injured person could die of hypothermia before dawn. "I'm rolling in 15 minutes. Send me everything you've got on my GPS unit." The truth was, I needed this search to go perfectly. 3 months ago, I'd lost a hiker, 70-year-old man with dementia who'd wandered off from his family. By the time we found him, it was too late. The family threatened lawsuits. The park administration launched an investigation into my search protocols. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, had made it crystal clear. One more screw-up and I'd be shuffling papers in Olympia instead of working the wilderness I loved. 20 minutes later, I was loading my pack into my truck under a sky that hung low and gray like a wool blanket. The familiar ritual of equipment check helped focus my mind. GPS unit, emergency radio, first aid kit, emergency shelter, 3 days of food, water purification tablets, headlamp, backup batteries, 550 cord, multi-tool, emergency flare gun. My pack weighed 42 pounds, heavy enough to matter on a long hike, light enough not to slow me down. The drive to the Hoh River Valley took me through increasingly dense forests where Douglas firs and western red cedars created a canopy so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. The air coming through my truck's vents carried that distinctive Pacific Northwest smell, Wet earth, decomposing leaves, and something green and alive that city people never quite understand. Brittany's Toyota Camry sat alone in the South Fork parking area, already covered in a light mist that made everything look surreal. I pulled on my latex gloves and peered through the windows. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. Car keys dangled from the ignition. A half-eaten granola bar lay on the dashboard and a water bottle sat in the cup holder, still 3/4 full. None of it made sense. You don't leave your keys in the ignition in bear country. You don't leave food visible in your car. And you definitely don't leave your purse behind when going on a day hike. I keyed my radio. Base, this is Carter at the South Fork trailhead. Vehicle inspection complete. Something's not right here. Copy that, Ryan. What are you seeing? Keys in ignition, purse visible, food left in the car. Either she left in a hurry or... I let the thought hang. Jenny would understand. Foul play? Too early to tell. I'm going to follow her planned route first, the Upper Hoh River Trail. If she changed her mind about which trail to take, there should be evidence. The Upper Hoh River Trail started innocently enough, winding through old-growth forest where ferns grew as tall as my shoulders, and moss covered everything in a green carpet that muffled sound. My boots made soft, squelching noises in the wet earth as I followed the well-maintained trail, scanning for any sign that Brittany had passed this way. After an hour of hiking, I found the first clue. A piece of blue fabric about 2 inches long, caught on a Douglas fir branch about chest height. I photographed it from multiple angles before carefully removing it and sealing it in an evidence bag. The fabric was fleece, good quality outdoor gear. According to her missing person report, Brittany had been wearing a blue North Face jacket. But the fabric was 12 feet off the main trail, in an area where there was no reason for a hiker to go. My radio crackled. Carter, this is Base. How's your progress? Found possible evidence, blue fleece fabric, matches description of missing person's jacket, but Jenny... I paused, studying the forest around me. It's in a weird location, like she was pulled off the trail rather than walking. Pulled? That's what I'm thinking. Continuing search pattern. I followed a faint game trail deeper into the forest, moving away from the maintained hiking route. The canopy grew thicker overhead, filtering the gray morning light into an underwater dimness that played tricks with depth perception. Every shadow could hide a bear. Every fallen log could conceal an injured hiker. That's when I started noticing the scratches. Deep gouges in the bark of trees running parallel to the ground at about shoulder height. Too high for a bear, too deep for elk antlers. I'd seen claw marks before, plenty of them in 17 years, but these were different. Longer, more deliberate, and they seemed to follow the same direction I was traveling. The second piece of evidence appeared 2 hours into my search. Brittany's hiking boot, wedged between 2 fallen logs in what looked like a natural trap. The leather was scuffed, the laces missing entirely. Dark stains covered the toe area, and when I leaned close, the metallic smell made my sinuses burn. Blood. Fresh enough to still smell, old enough to have darkened. I photographed everything, documented GPS coordinates, and carefully extracted the boot. Size 7 women's, matching the description in the missing person report. But as I examined it more closely, something made the muscles between my shoulder blades tighten. The boot looked like it had been chewed. Puncture marks dotted the leather in patterns that suggested teeth, but not bare teeth, which I knew intimately. These were more elongated, more numerous, like something with a mouthful of needles had tried to consume the boot and given up. Base, this is Carter. I kept my voice level, professional. Found missing person's footwear, requesting backup and possibly a crime scene team. Copy that. What's your location? I rattled off GPS coordinates while studying the ground around the boot location. The earth was disturbed, churned up like something large had thrashed around. Broken branches created a path of destruction leading deeper into the forest, away from any established trail. Ryan, Jenny's voice carried a note of concern I'd never heard before. Backup's at least 3 hours out. Weather's moving in faster than predicted. I looked up through the canopy. The light had grown noticeably dimmer, and the air carried that electric feeling that comes before a storm. Copy that. I'm going to follow the trail while I still can. What I should have done was wait for backup. In 17 years as a ranger, I'd learned that patience saves lives, both the victims and your own. But the dark stains on that boot told me Brittany might not have 3 hours. And if I lost another person on my watch. The trail of destruction led me deeper into old-growth forest where trees grew so massive they created their own microclimate. The air was colder here, thick with moisture and the smell of things slowly dying. Ferns grew in impossible shades of green, and moss hung from branches like tattered curtains. I'd been following the trail for another hour when I found the campsite. It wasn't a human campsite. The clearing looked deliberately created, with small trees broken off at ground level and larger ones showing those same mysterious claw marks. Bones littered the area, deer bones mostly, but others I couldn't immediately identify. They'd been cracked open, the marrow extracted. And in the center of the clearing, arranged with an almost ritualistic precision, were human belongings. A smartphone, Brittany's iPhone based on the pink case. A small day pack, torn open with the contents scattered. Energy bars with bites taken out of them, but the bite marks were wrong. Too large, showing too many teeth. A water bottle punctured with holes that matched the patterns on the boot. But no Brittany. I keyed my radio, but got only static. The forest had grown too dense, the terrain too complicated for reliable communication. I tried my cell phone, no bars. For the first time in 17 years of search and rescue, I felt truly isolated. That's when I heard the sound. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing. More of a vibration felt through the soles of my boots than an actual sound. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. Not quite human, but close enough to make every nerve in my body fire at once. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. I'd heard plenty of animal sounds in my career. Elk bugles, cougar screams, bear huffs, and woofs. This was none of those. This was something else entirely, and every instinct I'd developed in 17 years was screaming at me to get the hell out of these woods. But somewhere in this nightmare forest, Brittany Wilson might still be alive. I forced myself to examine the scattered belongings more carefully. The bite marks in the energy bars showed a jaw structure, unlike anything in my field guides. The puncture holes in the water bottle were spaced in patterns that suggested multiple rows of teeth, and the way the belongings had been arranged suggested intelligence, not the random scatter of a bear raid, but something deliberate, something that wanted to be found. The light was failing fast now, filtered through multiple layers of canopy and the approaching storm clouds. I had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left, and the temperature was already dropping. If I was going to find Brittany alive, it had to be soon. The trail continued deeper into the forest, marked by more of those claw marks on trees and occasional tufts of blue fabric. Whatever had taken her was marking its territory, leaving a breadcrumb trail for me to follow. The rational part of my mind recognized this as predatory behavior, leading me away from help, away from radio contact, into terrain where it held every advantage. But I kept following. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. The trail led to a ravine I'd never seen before, despite 17 years of exploring this wilderness. It cut deep into the earth like a wound, with walls of dark stone that seemed to absorb what little light remained. At the bottom, perhaps 30 feet down, I could see the white foam of fast-moving water, and echoing up from those depths, unmistakably human, came a voice calling for help. Help. Please. Someone help me. Brittany. Had to be. I rigged my rappelling gear to a sturdy Douglas fir and began my descent into the ravine. The stone walls were slick with moisture and covered in moss that made every handhold treacherous. Halfway down, my headlamp beam picked up movement in the shadows below. Brittany, can you hear me? This is Ryan Carter, National Park Service. I'm coming down to get you. Thank God. I'm hurt bad. I think my leg is broken. The voice was definitely female, definitely distressed, coming from a pile of fallen logs and debris at the bottom of the ravine. But as I descended further, something made me pause. The voice was too clear, too strong for someone who'd been missing for over 24 hours in October weather. And there was something else, an odd echo, like the words were being repeated a split second after they were first spoken. I touched down at the bottom of the ravine and immediately felt the wrongness of the place. The sound of the water was too loud, too chaotic. The air smelled of decay and something else, something musky and wild that made my nose burn. And despite the voice I'd heard, I couldn't see Brittany anywhere. "Where are you?" I called, sweeping my headlamp beam across the debris. "Over here, behind the big log." I followed the voice, stepping carefully over slippery stones and rotting wood. My boots squelched in mud that felt too thick, too warm for October. And the smell was getting stronger, like a butcher shop left in the sun. That's when my headlamp beam found the bones. Human bones, scattered among the deer remains and other forest detritus. A skull, cracked open like an egg. Rib bones picked clean. A femur with teeth marks that matched the patterns I'd been seeing all day. And no Brittany Wilson. "Help me, please." The voice was coming from directly above me now, from the darkness beyond my headlamp's reach. I tilted the beam upward and saw movement in the shadows. Something large shifting among the branches of a dead tree that grew horizontally from the ravine wall. "Ryan, I'm up here." But the voice wasn't coming from the tree. It was coming from behind me, from the pile of logs where I'd first heard it. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and realized with crystal clarity what was happening. Something was mimicking Brittany's voice. Something that had been listening to her pleas for help long enough to perfect the imitation. And now it was using those cries to draw in fresh prey. Me. The rational part of my mind cataloged what I was dealing with. An apex predator with human-level intelligence, capable of vocal mimicry, with a jaw structure designed for cracking bones and extracting marrow. The scratched trees, the arranged belongings, the impossible trail that led exactly where it wanted me to go. I was being hunted by something that had been perfecting this technique for a very long time. "Help me, Ryan, don't leave me." The voice was perfect now. Desperate, feminine, heartbreaking. If I hadn't seen the bones, hadn't recognized the trap, I would have spent precious minutes searching for a victim who was already dead. Instead, I started climbing. My ascenders bit into the rope as I hauled myself up the ravine wall, moving as fast as I could while still maintaining control. Above me, something large was moving through the trees, something that could travel through the canopy as easily as I moved on the ground. A branch crashed down beside me, thick as my thigh and heavy enough to crush my skull. Then another. It wasn't trying to knock me down, it was hurting me, keeping me on the rope, preventing me from finding handholds on the rock face. "Please don't go, I'm hurt bad." The voice followed me up, but now I could hear the wrongness in it, the slight electronic quality of a recording being played back, the way the inflection never quite matched the words. Whatever was hunting me had been listening to Brittany's final hours, learning her voice, preparing for the next victim. I reached the top of the ravine as the first drops of rain began falling. The forest had grown completely dark now, my headlamp creating a small bubble of visibility in an ocean of shadow. And somewhere in that darkness, something was moving parallel to my position, keeping pace as I tried to navigate back toward the main trail. My radio was still nothing but static. My GPS showed me roughly where I was, but the terrain between my position and safety was a maze of fallen logs, steep ravines, and dense underbrush that would be nearly impossible to navigate in darkness. I was 3 miles from help, alone in the forest with a predator that knew these woods better than I ever would. But I was still alive, and 17 years of experience hadn't taught me how to give up. I moved as quietly as possible, using game trails and avoiding areas where my headlamp would silhouette me against the sky. Every few minutes, I would hear movement in the canopy above, branches rustling, the soft thud of something large moving from tree to tree. It was tracking me, but it wasn't attacking. That suggested intelligence, patience. It was waiting for the right moment, the right terrain, probably somewhere ahead, where it had prepared another trap. The rain was falling harder now, turning the forest floor into a slippery mess of mud and rotting leaves. My breath came in sharp puffs of vapor, and despite my exertion, I could feel the cold seeping through my uniform. Hypothermia was now as much a threat as whatever was hunting me. I'd been moving for an hour when I found the second campsite. This one was different, older, more elaborate. Bones were arranged in careful patterns around a central clearing, some bleached white by weather, others still showing traces of flesh. A lean-to shelter had been constructed from branches and bark, and inside I could see more human belongings. Wallets, jewelry, scraps of clothing. This thing had been hunting people for years, and displayed prominently on a flat rock in the center of the clearing, like an offering or a challenge, was a Park Service radio. My heart stopped. The radio was a newer model than mine, with a digital display that still glowed faintly in the darkness. There was only one way a creature like this could have obtained Park Service equipment. It had killed a ranger. I approached the radio carefully, scanning the shadows for movement. The device looked undamaged, and when I picked it up, the battery indicator showed half power. I turned it on and was rewarded with the beautiful sound of static. Not the dead silence of a broken radio, but the white noise of a functioning unit searching for a signal. "Base, this is Carter. Emergency traffic. Come in. Over." Nothing but static. I tried again, angling the antenna in different directions. Any station, this is Ranger Carter with Olympic National Park. I have an emergency situation and require immediate assistance." Still nothing. But as I was adjusting the frequency, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice coming from the darkness beyond the clearing. "Base, this is Carter. Emergency traffic. Come in. Over." The mimicry was perfect. Not just the words, but my inflection, my tone, even the slight rasp I got when I was stressed. It had been listening to me, learning my voice just as it had learned Brittany's. Any station. This is Ranger Carter with Olympic National Park." Now there were two of my voices speaking in unison from different directions, then three, then four. The forest filled with my own desperate radio calls, creating a surround sound nightmare that made it impossible to determine where the real threat was coming from. I shut off the radio and ran. Branch whipped across my face as I crashed through undergrowth, following what I hoped was still the general direction of the main trail. Behind me, my own voice continued calling for help, now mixed with Brittany's pleas and what sounded like other victims. A child crying for its mother, an old man begging for mercy, a woman screaming. All the voices this thing had collected over the years, all the final moments it had witnessed and recorded in whatever passed for its memory. I'd covered maybe half a mile when I realized I was no longer being followed. The voices had faded behind me, and the forest had returned to its natural nighttime sounds. The drip of rain, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant call of an owl. But I didn't slow down. Something that intelligent wouldn't give up so easily. It was either preparing another trap or... The thought hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't following me because it didn't need to. It knew where I was going, back to the main trail, back to my truck, back to civilization, and it could travel through the canopy much faster than I could move on the ground. It was going to be waiting for me. I changed direction, angling northwest toward what I hoped was the Hoh River. If I could reach the water, I could follow it downstream to the ranger station. It would take longer and the terrain would be more difficult, but it might give me an advantage this thing didn't expect. The sound of running water reached my ears after another hour of careful navigation. The Hoh River was running high from recent rains, but it was navigable. I followed the bank downstream, using the sound of the water to mask my movement. That's when I saw the light. A flashlight beam, maybe quarter-mile ahead, sweeping back and forth across the water. Someone was on the riverbank and they were searching for something. My first thought was rescue. Backup had finally arrived, and they were looking for me. I was about to call out when caution made me pause. The beam was moving wrong, too erratic, too random, and it was completely silent. No voices, no radio chatter, no sound of boots on gravel. I crept closer, using riverside boulders as cover, until I could see the source of the light. It stood about 8 feet tall on legs that bent the wrong way at too many joints. Its torso was human in basic shape, but too long, too narrow, covered in what looked like dark fur or feathers. Arms that reached nearly to the ground ended in hands with too many fingers, each tipped with claws that glinted in the flashlight beam. But it was the head that made me understand what I was truly dealing with. Elongated like a wolf's but larger, with a jaw that could unhinge like a snake's to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. Eyes that reflected the light like mirrors, too large and too intelligent for any natural predator. And it was wearing clothes. Tattered remnants of what had once been a Park Service uniform hung from its impossible frame. A name tag was still pinned to the shirt pocket, though I couldn't read it from this distance. This thing had once been human, a ranger like me, transformed by something I didn't want to understand. The Wendigo of Algonquian legend, a human who had resorted to cannibalism during times of famine and been transformed into something monstrous, forever hungry for human flesh. It was using my flashlight, or rather, the flashlight of some previous victim, to hunt, playing the role of a rescuer to draw in prey, just as it had used voices to lure me into the ravine. But now, I had an advantage it didn't know about. I knew what it was, and I knew it was trying to trap me at this exact spot. I backed away carefully, but not toward the forest. Instead, I moved upstream, toward a section of the river I remembered from previous searches. The water ran fast and deep there, with a current strong enough to sweep away anything that fell in, including Wendigos. It took me 20 minutes to work my way back upstream to where I wanted to be. The creature was still playing lighthouse with its stolen flashlight, sweeping the beam back and forth across the water, waiting for me to approach the light like a moth. I found a boulder the size of a washing machine and worked it loose from the riverbank. It took every bit of strength I had, and the noise was louder than I would have liked. But finally it crashed down into the water with a splash that echoed off the canyon walls. The flashlight beam immediately swung toward the sound. I could hear movement, something large crashing through the underbrush toward my position. But I was already moving, staying low, working my way along the riverbank toward where the light had been. The Wendigo reached the boulder in less than a minute. I could hear it splashing in the shallows, investigating the disturbance, probably trying to determine if I had fallen into the water. Its movements were quick, predatory, but also cautious. It had learned to be careful over the years of hunting, but it had also learned to be overconfident. I found what I was looking for about 50 yards downstream from where the creature was searching, a section where recent storms had undercut the bank, creating an overhang of earth and roots that hung over deep water. The current ran fast here, and there were rocks just below the surface that would make swimming nearly impossible. I picked up a stone the size of my fist and hurled it into the forest on the opposite side of the river. The sound of the impact was immediately followed by the crash of something large moving through the trees at inhuman speed. The Wendigo could travel through the canopy, but it still had to come down to ground level to investigate disturbances. I threw another stone, this one further downstream, then another. Each impact drew the creature further from the river, further from its safe hunting ground, closer to where I needed it to be. On the fourth stone, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for, the Wendigo dropping from the trees onto the opposite bank, right where the overhang was most unstable. I had one chance. The emergency flare gun in my pack had been standard equipment for 17 years, used to signal rescue helicopters or mark locations during night searches. I'd never fired it at a living creature, but desperate times required desperate measures. The flare ignited with a brilliant red light that temporarily blinded me, but I could hear the impact as it struck something large and wet on the opposite bank. The Wendigo's scream was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part human agony, part animal rage, part something else entirely that made my teeth ache. But more importantly, the sound was followed by a rumbling crash as the undercut bank gave way. The creature's weight, combined with the shock of the flare impact, had destabilized the overhang I'd been counting on. I heard the splash as tons of earth and roots collapsed into the fast-moving water, taking the Wendigo with it. For a moment, there was only the sound of the river. Then, from downstream came a wailing cry that grew fainter and fainter as the current carried its source away. I waited another hour before I dared to move, listening for any sound that might indicate the creature had survived. But the forest remained quiet except for natural night sounds, and eventually I accepted that my gambit had worked. The Wendigo was gone, swept away by the same river system it had been using to hunt victims for God knew how many years. Dawn was breaking by the time I reached the ranger station. My radio had finally picked up a signal about a mile from civilization, and I'd been able to contact base and call off the search teams that were preparing to look for me. The official report was sanitized, of course. A predator, species unknown, responsible for multiple disappearances over several years. The campsite with its collection of human remains became a crime scene, investigated by state police and federal agents who asked a lot of questions I couldn't answer honestly. Brittany Wilson's remains were never found, but enough evidence was recovered from the creature's lair to officially close her case. Her family got closure, if not the ending they'd hoped for. And me? I kept my job. 17 years of experience, plus solving a case that had baffled law enforcement for years, earned me commendation rather than censure. The investigation into my previous search protocols was quietly dropped. But I know what I encountered in those woods. I know that somewhere in the Olympic Peninsula, there are predators that wear human faces and speak with human voices. Creatures that were once people like us, transformed by hunger and desperation into something that feeds on human flesh and human fear. I still work these forests, still conduct search and rescue operations, still help people who get lost in the wilderness. But now I carry extra supplies, extra weapons, extra caution. Because I learned something during those dark hours beside the Ho River. Sometimes the thing you're hunting is also hunting you. And sometimes when you're alone in the deep woods with something that used to be human, the only way to save the next victim is to make sure there isn't one. The Wendigo I fought may be gone, but the transformation that created it, that's still out there, waiting for the next person desperate enough to cross a line that can never be uncrossed. So when you're hiking alone in the deep forest and you hear a voice calling for help from the darkness, remember my story. Remember Brittany Wilson. And ask yourself, do you really want to find out what's making that sound? Did you enjoy this supernatural encounter? What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales from the wilderness.